Hello, Guilty Feminist. This is Deborah. We've got lots of interesting things coming up. On the 4th of September, we're going to be in Newcastle at Live Theatre doing a Guilty Feminist on the Friday night. And on the Saturday, we're going to be doing one of our big open space days where you can come along, you can bring a question or a suggestion or an idea, as long as it's under the banner of how we form a meaningful resistance and create a better existence for ourselves. We're very concerned about the rise of the far right. This is under the Road to Gilead project. If you are in Newcastle or can get to Newcastle, we wanted to do something in the north, also something close to Scotland. We would love, love, love to have you there. So we'll be Friday night show, all day Saturday will be our open space. If you want to know about those things, you go to guiltyfeminist.com and look under live shows and you'll see those events there. We will be at the London Podcast Festival on the 13th of September in the afternoon, and we'll be at the Vision Festival on the 25th of September at Town Hall near King's Cross. And that will be an incredible show with some really dynamic women from the King's Cross area, which is all now about academics, ideas, culture. It's going to be really, really wonderful. Thank you so much for listening. Go to guiltyfeminist.com to get tickets for any of those live events. And now on with the podcast. Live from London, the Spontaneity Shop presents The Guilty Feminist with me, Deborah Frances-White, and my very special guest, Natasha Devon, talking about the Nuance Drought. Hello, Guilty Feminists. My guest today is a writer, broadcaster and activist who conducts research on mental health, body image and gender inequality. She campaigns both on and offline to make the world a fairer place. You may have heard her voice on her weekly radio show on LBC, and now you can read her book, The Nuance Drought, where she writes about the ways in which the world is becoming increasingly polarised. Please welcome back to the podcast, Natasha Devon.
Woo! Thank you.
Now, Natasha, you've not been on the podcast for years. I think you did one at King's Place 100 years ago.
It was so long ago.
So long ago. Early doors for the Guilty Feminist.
Yeah.
But you haven't aged a day. I know I'm a feminist, but I'm not meant to say that. But really, where is the evidence that so many years have gone by? Probably 8 years have gone by. No evidence.
Thank you very much.
Whatever your skincare is, I would like to know. You have written a book. And when I read it, I was like, oh my God, this is so fits like two hands together praying for a better future with my book, 6 Conversations We're Scared to Have, because they're both about polarization and what we do about this idea that we can't have a conversation with any nuance anymore. It's like, you're this camp or you're this camp. And that's, pick a team and stick with that team. But what that doesn't do is create progress or build bridges that we need in order to be able to communicate better with each other and agree on policy or change. And also, I think something I say in my book is, because from my experience in a cult, it makes you bury the truth. You bury your true feelings and you just say the party line. But inside you're thinking, I'm not sure that's right entirely. I think it's more complicated than that. And therefore, when you bury that truth and you swallow it down, you're not really believing what you're saying, and therefore, do you really act with conviction? Not really. If you think, I kind of believe half of what these people I'm hanging around with say, but also I've got some other thoughts correctly of my own, because I am a human being with my own autonomous thoughts and brain and view of the world.
Indeed, yeah. It's incredibly similar books that we wrote that cover a lot of the same themes. But one of the things that I talk about in the psychology section, which is kind of the second section of the book, is that you signal to your tribe, or stan, as you would call it, you signal that you are one of them by saying certain slogans. One of which is, apparently there's a big debate in the psychological community as to whether flat earthers actually believe that the earth is flat.
Oh, really?
But they'll put that out into the online space, and what they're signaling is, I don't agree with the status quo. Right. I'm anti-science, and therefore, if you're a bit like me, come, let's have a conversation. And I think we do that a lot, more than we realize.
We just hang a lantern on something we think other people who think like us might agree with, even if it's not something we completely endorse or believe, or we think, there's a complexity there, but broadly I think that, we put that out there like a shop window, hoping that people will be drawn to us.
Yes.
Hopefully not flat earth, but...
But it's not helped by the fact that all content is going in that direction. And one of the chapters in the book is about the media and how the media is obsessed with their content's second life on social media.
Can you tell me more about that? Because I thought that was very interesting, the way you wrote about that.
Yeah, it's... So all legacy media, what's now called legacy media, is hemorrhaging their audiences.
Right.
So the way that they kind of justify their existence to the shareholders is through this thing that they will call reach. Right. So they'll say, okay, we've got less viewers or less listeners or fewer readers, and they're not seeing the advertising. But when we put this clip on social media, we increased our reach by millions, which means that our brand is still being seen by millions and millions of people. Right. So they take that to the shareholders and use that as a way to get another series of whatever it is commissioned. But it's objectively a really strange thing to do.
Yes.
Because social media is what's putting legacy media out of business. But also, I think there is a thirst for balanced, nuanced debate that legacy media could really lean into. They could say, look, if you're really fed up with all this polarized, oversimplified shit that you're seeing online.
3 things I would never do. 1 thing you must always do. All of that extreme stuff that clearly isn't true. There's not only 3 exercises for your core. And if you don't do them, you'll melt into a puddle of jelly. And if you do them, you're going to look like this guy who's 22 and has done nothing but crunches since he was 12. No, neither of those things are true. But here are some quite good core exercises you might benefit from that only take 10 minutes a day. Isn't a hook that draws people in.
No.
So we have to lie all the time now.
But when I first started on LBC, I used to have a lot of arguments with people because I'd gone from... most of my work's in education, which is a very progressive space. And there are things that I thought we'd agreed on as humanity kind of thing. Yes. And then what LBC did was just open me up to all of the people who don't work in education and are not my friends and family, who have very, very different opinions on things. And I was having real barneys with people all the time and all of these viral clips. But then I sort of got to a point where I thought, I don't want to do it like that anymore. I wanted it to be a place for people who enjoy thinking and to really dig down into the issues. And that's when the show really took off. I've quadrupled the audience since I inherited it, but it's really gone up steeply in the past couple of years, which I think shows that there is an appetite for it.
Because you have been doing more nuanced debate and not just polarised.
Yeah. But people don't think I'm with LBC anymore because they never see me online because none of my, unless you follow me on Instagram, you'll never see any of my clips because they don't go viral because I'm not shouting at a reform supporter.
Right. So so what kind of discussions, could you give us an example of a discussion you've had that has built your audience but wouldn't get 1 million views on TikTok?
One of my favourite ones that we did was about gangs. And I can't remember what the story was exactly, but I do remember that the tabloids did exactly what you would expect in terms of dehumanizing people who have been members of gangs and making them seem very animalistic and people that shouldn't be part of society and inherently criminal, etc. And I took a bit of a risk and said, I only want you to pick up the phone if you have been in a gang.
Oh.
Yeah, which is always a risky thing because you could end up with a completely empty switchboard. But it turned out lots of people who had that experience called me. And the way that they were describing it, I remember there was one guy who said, you have to remember, he said, I grew up on an estate, and on an estate, everything, because they're trying to keep you in. So the shop is there, the laundrette is there, everything that you need to your day-to-day existence is there within a few meters. And he said, you got to imagine, my mum would say to me, can you go and get a pint of milk? And as soon as I left my front door, I would have these guys following me saying, join us or we're going to hurt you. And So it was, the just complete feeling of being trapped, of like, I either join this gang or they're going to do something really terrible to me.
And they threaten families as well and say, we'll hurt your mom or something like that. So you think, well, I'd better do it.
Yeah. And you go, well, if I was you, I would have done exactly the same thing. And it's conversations like that. And you talk a lot about empathy in your book, that cognitive empathy, understanding what's brought someone to the place that they're at, that I just think is so important.
The difference between cognitive empathy and more emotional empathy, where you feel for somebody, I think there's become a trend now to think you shouldn't even think through how someone became a fascist in the 30s. Just don't think, that's empathizing, that's humanizing. And I'm like, if we don't even think it through intellectually, then we cannot avoid replicating it again. Like, of course we need to be thinking, but how would you get there? That's an intellectual exercise everyone should be doing to understand, well, perhaps that person who I don't like in my neighborhood, or the way that my, aunt thinks about politics or whatever, how did she get there? That's incredibly important. And one of the main reasons it's incredibly important is because it humanizes you. You mustn't lose your own humanity because you feel someone else is being inhumane.
Yes. But also, I think one of the things I talk about in the Nuance Drought is how we only ever can seem to recognize fascism retrospectively. Yes. And that's because we've turned Hitler and Mussolini into monsters.
Yes.
And so we don't recognize, when a human being is in front of us, we don't recognize those fascistic traits, because we go, oh, they can be really nice sometimes, not like Hitler, who was horrible all the time. And you're like, okay.
There really aren't any, I don't think, dictators who don't have some kind of charisma for at least a lot of people. Otherwise, how are they a dictator? So when you had this conversation about gangs, and how many people rang in and said they were from a gang?
It was one of those hours where we only maybe had 5 or 6 calls, but that was all we needed. If you have really good quality calls, you can keep them going for 10, 15 minutes sometimes.
And everyone you spoke to was able to tell you they had been in a gang? Was anyone currently in a gang, or had they'd all left?
It was all people who had left. There was one guy who his mum sent him to live. They had heritage in West Africa, and she sent him to live with some family that they had back in West Africa. And he said, that's exactly what I needed. I needed a perspective change because my world had got so small. And then suddenly I was in a place that was completely different and unfamiliar. And I realized that there was a great big world out there, and that made me reflect on who I was becoming. I just felt like I learned so much. And those are my favorite hours that we have, where I come away and I'm like, I'm going to be thinking about that for a good few days.
And did you get an incredible response from the audience, because they were able to hear gang members and empathize with them and think, God, these are usually young people who have been coerced and felt they had no other option, and then became involved in crime and perhaps committed crimes, or at least aid and abetted crimes. And did you get some great feedback from your listeners about how it changed their view?
The best feedback I get is actually when I see people out in the wild, because again, you see this particularly on the texts, that you have this kind of rolling ticker tape of texts that are coming into the studio. And it is, I mean, you can send a comment into LBC via your Alexa, and sometimes people are just shouting at their speaker. So I'm getting almost like a stream of consciousness of a really angry person. And it's just their first off the cuff thought. And often the best hours are the ones where actually the switchboard doesn't light up, because people are really thinking about what they're hearing. And then when you see those people, when you're out and about, they'll come up to you and go, I really love that hour that you did on this. They've thought about it.
Wow, and it's stuck with them.
Yeah.
And how are you managing to do that? One of the interesting things you said in the book was about the way that the BBC had interpreted their Ofcom responsibility. And if you're listening internationally, Ofcom is the body that regulates our media to make sure that it doesn't go rogue in some significant ways. Ofcom's important. But the way that the BBC, and this probably is the same for you wherever you're listening, in some way, shape or form, has interpreted balance has become in itself imbalanced.
Yes.
And I thought this was really interesting in your book because you are a public broadcaster. What they're meant to do is not before an election have only Labour MPs on to say their piece, because that's not representative of all the parties who are participating in a democracy. And we would expect that the parties with more MPs or more sway would get more airtime than those with very few. And there might be a very tiny party that doesn't get represented the whole time. But you can't have any of the main parties not represented before an election, which is right, because otherwise someone could control the BBC and decide, well, I like to vote Tory, so I want all of the viewers and the listeners only to hear from a Conservative perspective. So it's important that we have that for balance. How has it been interpreted in your experience? Where has that gone in the sort of, I think, because all of the whether you're a public broadcaster or whether you're a privately funded broadcaster that shows ads, you're still not allowed to use your station for propaganda in this country. How has that been misinterpreted, do you think, that has led us down a terrible garden path?
Well, it was actually Emily Maitlis's lecture that she gave, the McTaggart lecture, where she coined this term both sidesism. And the way that she described it is during the Brexit years, when she was a presenter on Newsnight, which is the BBC's kind of flagship show, she said it would take them 5 minutes, the researchers, to find 50 economists who were anti-Brexit, who thought that it would be a ludicrous thing to do.
Financial disaster for the country.
Financial disaster for the country, exactly. But then for balance, they had to find somebody who thought Brexit was a great idea. And it would sometimes take them hours to find an economist who would argue for Brexit. But by the time the show went to air, what the public saw was one economist who was against and one economist who was for. So the impression that the viewer gets is that there are just as many economists out there who are in favour of Brexit as who are against.
Right, because every week leading up to the vote for or against Brexit, there had to be someone on talking about that. And so the very few economists who thought it might be a good idea were very, very busy.
Exactly.
Because they were popping up everywhere because they had to be the balanced one.
I actually have heard somebody say, who works in media and is a little older than I am, that they decided to be pro the Iraq war because it was a way to get loads of work, because there were so few people who were pro it that they just knew their phone would ring and they would get loads of punditry work during that time.
That's how they built their reputation.
Presumably that's how they made their money.
There's certainly comedians who I think have gone the way of GB News. That was never their attitude before, but maybe they were a little bit more right-wing than other comedians, and then they thought, just lean into it. That's where my living is. And sure, some of them do believe it. Maybe they've drunk the Kool-Aid. Maybe they think it is correct. Maybe they absolutely would say, this is what I believe and shut up. You can't tell me what I think. But I do suspect that some of them just are thinking, well, there's more of a living over here, which is very sad when I think about that. But I think it's exceptionally dangerous for a public broadcaster or any broadcaster to interpret the rules as, for balance, we need to find an economist who disagrees with 1,000 other economists. John Oliver did something on this where he said, for every 1,000 scientists, probably more, to be honest, 100,000 scientists who believe in climate change, there'd be one that didn't. And he said, what we should show, if you want one that doesn't believe in climate change and denies it, you need, and he did this sort of visual gag of having 100 people in white coats dressed like professors on one side and one on the other, and said, well, this is what it really looks like. So if you do want that one voice, you should bring in a lecture hall of scientists who go, we're on this side, so that the public can see, because it is misleading and it isn't balanced. I mean, years ago, I'd been booked into Radio 5 Live to talk about my book, and I'd been booked in for months. That was my slot. And the day before this big news story blew up, where Christina Blasey Ford accused Brett Kavanaugh, who was being nominated for the Supreme Court, of having sexually assaulted her when she was a student. And she said, look, I think I need to speak up and say this is the character of the man. And they called me and said, look, because you're coming in to talk about feminism and this is the current story, we're going to need to book this other person for balance. And when they told me who it was, I said, please don't book him, because he has a reputation, and that reputation is not for calm and sensible debate. And his position was that he denied that Christina Blasey Ford anything had happened, and his position was that the Me Too movement was a crock and just a way to get at men. And so I gave them a list of names and said, look, if you think you need someone for balance, here are some comedians who I would say are on the right of things, but I can have a good, intelligent conversation with them. And I said, I think their view will be due process. We need to hear from him. We cannot assume and project guilt. And I can argue with that, and I can discuss things with that, and I will agree with some of the things that they're saying, but it will be a balanced conversation. And these people all have more profile than this man as well. And they said, oh, well, our boss and blah, blah, blah. And I just said to the researcher, I said, but we are shaping the world together. Anyone who's in the media is shaping the story of who's important, what's true, what's valid, what's up for debate, what, as you say, society has already decided is repugnant and no longer needs debating. There's a reason we don't go on public radio and debate that slavery is a good thing. Now, there was a time when people did publicly debate that, and then it became settled that we agreed that slavery was repugnant, and we don't debate that at the Oxford Union anymore. We don't debate that on LBC. And there are always some things outside the Overton window that we don't debate. And I said, please don't do this. I said, just whatever you do, don't do this. This is not balance. And they did do it. I said, please just don't do it. He said, I'll do my best. So I thought probably I've given them other people to call. And then on the day, I was put in a little room alone with him because it was in Salford and we were in London. And no, we weren't even supervised. And he was really horrible. And he accused me of some really nasty things that he'd dug up on a right-wing website. And I went, this isn't balance. This isn't balance. To me, this was, the height of the Me Too movement. To me, it's like saying, we've got this mouse on a seesaw. Well, the history of the world in terms of the Me Too movement is an elephant. So that's not balance. Yeah. You would need thousands of mice to make that seesaw balanced. And I think that's what they're not taking into account.
Yes. And the other thing, I write about it, is that I had quite a bad experience at the BBC because they wanted to ask me about what I felt were the main contributors to young people's mental health worsening since 2010. And obviously the easy answer to that is smartphones. Is certainly part of the picture, but there's various other things like austerity, for example. And I think that Michael Gove's education reforms had a huge impact on young people's mental health. And so I said to this BBC researcher, I'd really like to talk about what I'm seeing in schools, young people not having as much opportunity to do sports and arts with a proven therapeutic value, all of this increased testing and this emphasis on exams. It's having an impact on the teachers and on the students as well. And this researcher said, well, the thing is, I can't allow you to say that on air because the government aren't here to defend themselves. And so the way I interpreted that is that the government could just insulate themselves from criticism by not turning up. Not turning up, exactly. Yeah.
Do we think that a lot of nuance has gone out of discussion because of these kinds of fake balance radio and television debates?
I think a lot of nuance has gone out of the discussion because conflict is king and because attention grabbing is so important. We all occupy the attention economy. So there is a reward in coming up with a really extreme point of view. I was actually on another podcast earlier today with Femi Olawole, and he was saying that he spends a lot of time trying to think of the most attention-grabbing way he can present a nuanced view, because he knows that that's the only way that he will get booked by certain media organizations. The problem with that is that we're incentivizing politicians, commentators and content creators to come up with ever more extreme points of view. And that's part of the reason that we're seeing the Overton window shift further and further and further to the right. And it's not because these are sincerely held views a lot of the time, I don't think. It's just because the more eyeballs are on your content, the more money you can make.
That does seem to be the case. I talked about this recently, doing some stand-up on the show, but I'll mention it here because not everyone listens to every episode, and I'd like to tell you about it. We've been going for 10 years now, more. And when we started out as the Guilty Feminist, there was no video at all. It was what a podcast was. It was radio that nobody stops you making. And so, and then, the last few years, everything's these attention-grabbing videos, and that's the only way anyone finds your podcast. And somebody said to me, we've used this PR company who's helped us with, new ideas for finding a new audience, and they'd love to take you out for lunch. So I said, okay, I'm a relative dinosaur in podcasting terms, being 10 years old. I should go and hear what they've got to say. So these people took us out for lunch, probably nice people, but they were suggesting that I make these videos that were about controversial topics or that caused a fight, and then got people underneath to start fighting each other. So in other words, that's mostly going to be my followers fighting each other. And that's the opposite of what I've spent 10 years doing, which is to try and unite us and to get us to act together and move as one and care about the same things and let the little things go. And I'm a feminist, but it doesn't matter what, little hypocrisies or insecurities we've got. Let's get cracking. And I said, I don't respond to that. It doesn't feel like something I want to do, because I want people to be engaged with curiosity, with positivity, with how do we make the world a better place, compassion. Why do you think those things? I mean, I think my audience does want that, and you've said your audience has quadrupled. You are building an audience, but why do you think that the received wisdom is that you cannot build an audience with joy and curiosity? And
because it's harder. There is an algorithm literally for engagement farming in the way that you've just described. And you've seen, I was watching George Monbiot talk about this, and he said there are certain trending, not hashtags, but sort of trending topics within usually the US culture wars, that if you can keep on top of them and week in, week out, ensure that you are discussing those and addressing those in your content, then you will draw an audience through, almost guaranteed, you will farm an audience. But what that's done is it's made even people who were previously on the left are now sort of engaged in all of these right-wing talking points. And that's ultimately, I read a brilliant book called The Year of the Rats. Have you read it?
No.
Harry Shukman, he's a Jewish guy who went undercover in the far right for a year.
Right.
And it's an incredible book. I'd really, really recommend it. And he managed to infiltrate them, persuade them that he had a completely different name and identity, and was able to secretly record them and report back on what their actual aims are and what they're actually talking about. Interestingly, they are just as anti-Semitic as they ever were, but there is an agreement that that's not spoken about publicly because it's advantageous to pretend that you are defending Jewish people and they hate Muslims more. But if there were no Muslims, they would, still be.
God.
Yeah. But one of the things that he said is that a key aim of the far right is to shift the Overton window, the accepted ideas that you were talking about earlier. And the more that they can get these, what would have previously been considered unthinkable ideas, into mainstream discourse, the more of a victory they felt they've won. And he says that it's therefore a disaster. And he was writing this a couple of years ago, that Labour would try and copy reform because in doing so, they will shift the Overton window in that direction.
So it's a disaster for us if Labour copy reform.
A disaster for society. Because I always think about remigration, this whole concept of remigration, which is now completely mainstream on sites like X. Mm-hmm. That is ethnic cleansing. Mm-hmm. 10 years ago, if there was a politician that was openly talking about ethnic cleansing, we would have said, you're a disgrace, get out of politics. And now this has become something that is just openly discussed and even celebrated. We're descending really fast, I think.
So, and the Overton window, in case there's any listeners who don't know what that is, it is the spectrum of conversation that's socially acceptable to discuss. So like I was saying before, you couldn't now suggest a debate at the Oxford Union or on Question Time about the validity of slavery, enslaving people yet. But no one would suggest it. It wouldn't come up. No one would think it was valuable or valid. And they'd think it was pretty horrific that someone was suggesting it. I went to the Oxford Union to debate a couple of Christmases ago. I went to debate Roe versus Wade after it had been overturned. Well, when I was at Oxford, 97 to 2000, we would never have debated abortion. That was done. That was settled. They'd have just seen as a boring waste of time because we all agree, and who's going to debate on the other side? Who's going to say we should recriminalise abortion? But now it is back. And so one of the things Andrew Tate said, and I quoted it in an article I wrote about him recently, is, and there's a podcast, you can see it. Actually, if you look it up, the Nerve News, and just my name, Deborah Frances-White, and Tate, the article will come up and it'll quote the podcast. But he said, I've done a lot to shift the Overton window. So Andrew Tate knows he is an extremely radical voice. But I suspect, and I don't know this, I suspect he's been paid to move the Overton window, because if he's saying the most heinous, hideous stuff, it makes the broadcasters who are just like, who have podcasts called Nice Guys Just Asking Questions About Females, those guys seem reasonable compared to Andrew Tate. Well, he's not Andrew Tate, he's just asking questions. And yeah, he is now saying that maybe we did a disservice to the family when we gave women the vote. Maybe we should bring it back to the family because we've all become too individualistic. And in fact, Andrew Tate gave that as an example. He said, when I first started, I could make national headlines for saying something as basic as women can't drive. And now he says, everyone on the internet is screaming that women shouldn't have the vote. He said, I shifted that Overton window. So he knows what he's doing. You're right. It's an absolute agenda. But we play into it when we engage.
Yeah.
I think this is why I try and write something for the Nerve News or the Independent or something like that. I try and write a nuanced article because by just adding comments underneath, we're playing into their game.
Yes. And I've thought about this a lot, that the culture war talking points, there was a time sort of, I would say 2012 to 2015, where I was never off the telly debating things that didn't matter, the kind of wrong question phenomenon, talking about things which got people riled up, but actually in the scheme of things. And there's a certain amount of guilt I feel about that. But then I think, well, if I hadn't done that, I wouldn't be in a position where I would have got my show on LBC, where I now have a platform where I'm in charge of what we discuss and what the question is and the parameters of the debate. Because no one would know who I was.
Right.
But looking back on that period of time, I recognize the extent to which I played into that because I argued things that I sort of did believe, but I didn't believe them in exactly the way they were asking me to argue them.
Yes.
Because they wanted it to be really clean and simple with no complexity in it.
Yes. I remember that era so well. I used to get called up about 3 times a week. And because I had the podcast that was comedy, I didn't need to do that to build the reputation to get what you've got now, and I've got a different thing. So, this is no judgment on you at all, because I understand it. I was in a very different position. But I used to get called up 3 times a week by the BBC at that point going, they're trying to ban Baby, It's Cold Outside this Christmas.
Yeah.
Could you come on and describe and sort of explain why you think that's a good idea? And I'm like, I'm not Mary Whitehouse. Like, no. I remember once them calling me up to say, there's a Benny Hill fun run. Now, younger listeners, can I just explain firstly, Baby, It's Cold Outside is a song in which there's a sort of
coercive element.
Yeah, coercive element. And actually, I think it's probably ironic. I think she's sort of, it's a game, but there is one line that says, what's in this drink, which makes it sound like there's some kind of date rape drug in there. And so there was a period of time where people, especially, it was around the Me Too era, were like, oh, maybe we just curate a different song. Maybe we just play Jingle Bell Rock this year. Maybe we don't have that, because it just felt very out of step with the time. And the Benny Hill fun run. Benny Hill was a 1970s comedian, and his television show would always start with a fast motion of him running around chasing women in bikinis. And he was like a sort of short, the joke was he was a short, middle-aged, bald man who was chasing all these really kind of gorgeous, leggy blondes, was the idea of it. I'm a feminist, but just describe them as leggy blondes. But that was the joke. That was that was what we were meant to be thinking it was. And so they were doing this Benny Hill fun run. And that meant that all the women were going to dress in bikinis and all the men were going to dress like Benny Hill. And they were going to play this music that famously goes with it, which goes context. There'll be lots of people around the world and young people who won't know this. And they rang me and said, they're going to do a Benny Hill fun run. Can you comment on this in terms of feminism? And the researcher wanted me to be Mary Whitehouse. Mary Whitehouse was just a self-styled citizen in the 1980s who would basically say ban this filth to anything that she thought was salacious in content. And she was a big, big public figure. So they want me to be that person. They want me to go, I think this is disgusting and it's really setting feminism back 20 years. And they said, remember the researcher said to me, what do you think of this? And I just said, they just rang me on my mobile. How do they even have my number? And I just went, I think people should do what they want to do.
Yeah.
I said, if people want to go for a run, I am not interested in telling them what they should wear. I'm not interested in telling women to cover up. I'm not interested in telling them to take more clothes off. I'm not interested in telling men they shouldn't run with women. Is it doing anything for the sisterhood? No, obviously not. Obviously not. Obviously it's not a big leap forward for feminism to have a Benny Hill fun run. But I have no interest in telling people they can't do a Benny Hill fun run if that's what they want to do. I am a Generation X comedian. I'm not interested in hectoring people or banning things or where did you get this idea that because I was a feminist, I wanted to ban things? I don't want to ban anything. And I don't also think that Baby It's Cold Outside has been banned. I think radio DJs are curating something else. That's what I think has happened. And I remember saying to that researcher, like, is it banned? And they were like, yeah. I said, but what would happen if I sang it tonight in a karaoke bar? And they said, oh, well, you could do that. And I said, so it's not banned? No, but they're not playing it on the radio. I said, but what would happen if someone did play it on the radio? And what would be the penalty? Well, no, they're just not. I was like, okay. So I said, and I remember I was on the way to a fundraiser show that we were doing at Christmas for for shelter. And I said, I will come on your show. And I will come on your show tonight to talk about the fact that, baby, it's cold outside and there are people sleeping on the street and we need money for shelter. I do not give a fuck what Christmas songs people do or do not listen to. I don't think Baby It's Cold Outside was written with some horrendous intent. I also think that the zeitgeist this year is telling people maybe pull back on that and playing the little drummer boy instead. I don't give a fuck. That I remember that poor researcher. I just said, please curate something better. You are just causing division and you are telling people that people like me, because I'm a feminist and I want the world to be better for all human beings, and I can see that it in some ways is significantly worse for women, and I'm a woman, so I'm trying to fix that, as well as lots of homeless people, more homeless men than women, which we're doing something for Shelter Tonight. Can we not talk about those things that are actually important? And the poor researcher, I'm sure I didn't say fuck to the researcher, but that was the attitude, went, oh, okay, thank you very much for your time, blah, blah, blah. All great leaders are storytellers. A manager can tell you what to do, but a leader tells you the story of how things can be. There are no great leaders who aren't shaping a vision, and a vision is a story of the future. We have never needed leaders more because the world has never been a more uncertain place. I'm hearing from businesses all the time now, we don't know what this industry, this business, this project is going to look like in 5 years' time. We've no way of knowing. And that means the world is hungry for leaders, hungry for people who can tell a story of what the future might look like. Now, you might say, I'm not a storyteller, I'm not creative. I'm going to ask you this. Do you worry? Do you have anxiety about the future? Because if so, you're a storyteller. Worry is just your brain offering you a story for free. Anxiety is your subconscious writing a story for you. It's not that great leaders don't worry. Of course they do. But great leaders don't say that's the end of the story. They say there's a bigger story than that, a better story than that. To do this, you need to be able to tell really good stories. You need to be able to understand how stories work. You need to be able to take them apart and put them back together. The Storytelling Leadership Academy is an online program of seminars, coaching, resources for leaders who need to find their voice and tell their story. To find out more and to book your place, go to the-spontaneity-shop.com or just click the link in the show notes. The course starts on the 28th of September and places are limited.
But that if a debate contains the word banned, I am immediately suspicious. The last time, it was years ago now, but the last time I was invited on Good Morning Britain, it was because they were trying to argue that schools had banned the words mum and dad.
Oh, God.
And so I went and I found what the local authority guidance was. And the local authority guidance said, when you are talking to groups of children,
Yes.
say grown-ups at home, because you don't know all of their individual circumstances. However, if you are talking to a child that you know has a mum and a dad, by all means, say mum and dad. And so they said, will you argue that it's right to ban the words mum and dad? And I actually went, yeah, I will. I sort of tricked them a bit because then when I got
you got on the radio.
I got on air and I said, this whole parameters of this debate are wrong when you look at what the guidance actually says. And I haven't been invited back since.
Well, do you know what? When I said to the researcher, Baby's Carol, I thought, oh, fuck, I wish I had just said, oh, yes, yes, yes. I thought the same thing. I wish I'd just said, yes, 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 I will come and say that it was correct to ban Baby It's Cold Outside, and then get on and go, I really had a change of heart because I think the lyrics are so relevant at the moment because, baby, it is cold outside and people need a home to stay. And actually, Shelter's doing this really incredible thing and I should have just done it.
Yeah.
But I knew I would never be invited back if you do it. But to be honest, I think I'm okay with that. Like, just doing one big hilarious thing where you actually turn it around, I think is the right way to go. Because what they're trying to do there with the mum and dad thing is they're trying to say gay parents are infiltrating your school and banning the mum and dad because they want you to say dad and dad or mum and mum. That is not what's happening. Some children have caregivers.
Yeah.
So some children live with their gran and some children live with a foster parent. And so when you say mum and dad, lots of small children might go, oh, that doesn't apply to me. Ask your mum and dad if they can bring in, and it just makes them feel a bit excluded and a bit crap.
Exactly.
What is wrong with that?
Why would you not do that? And a lot of the things that have been framed as banning of language are actually just really common sense inclusion policies.
Yes. Well, in fact, I talk about that in my book because there's always a big furore about the NHS now calls breastfeeding chest feeding, and it calls, women people with ovaries. And it's like, it doesn't. But it says, the guidance says, if you are talking to somebody who's non-binary or transmasculine, they may not feel comfortable with you saying breasts. So perhaps you could say chest. Or you could ask them. That's what it says. At no point does saying for a collective, those who have ovaries may wish to check blah, 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 blah. It doesn't mean that in common parlance in life, we then go, I'm going out with the ovary havers tonight. That's not, I'm going out with the girls. Are you meeting up with the lads? There was a big, big, big pushback on, my friend Carrie Lloyd had said something about, very shorthand, she had 140 characters and she was doing something for a bloody good period and she said something like menstruators. And she had so much kickback, she went off Twitter. I think she cancelled her subscription.
Wow.
This was in the Twitter age. But I said, well, yeah, but the bus driver says passengers and the doctor says patients. In that context, the relevant thing about me is I'm a passenger or a patient. It's not that I'm a woman. In this instance, you're talking about periods. My menstruation is the most relevant thing. But in another context, I wouldn't like that. I don't want to be called a menstruator at the pub.
No.
But if you're asking me to collect tampons for people who don't have any, fine.
My favourite chapter in your book is the one about trans rights. I think you handle it so beautifully.
Thank you.
And I understood that cis women and trans people's rights are completely intertwined. But what I didn't think that I had fully appreciated until I read your book is that it's used as a way to divide feminists, because then it's easier to control us and take away our rights, etc. And it's kind of made me a bit determined, because there are kind of usually sort of second wave feminists that I know who I have an enormous amount of respect for, who are anti-trans, and it's made me go off them.
Of course, yeah.
But it's made me determined to be like, no, I'm going to keep talking to you. I'm going to make you like me. I'm going to keep pointing out the points of commonality that we have, because if I turn my back on you, that's what they want.
Yes, and I think I understand why some people can't, and some people do go, I can't do that now. But if you can, and you have that commonality, and you use that commonality to have nuanced discussions that allows them to take a step towards or acknowledge something, what I have realised is it doesn't matter who builds the bridge. Once it's built, anyone can walk over it.
Yeah.
And there was somebody who's quite famous at a party I was at once, and he's old school famous, but he and I ended up having a long conversation where I just asked him lots of gentle questions. And the big thing that I said to him that I think got him, and I would say he put 1 foot on the bridge, maybe 1.5 feet. But I thought, well, that's all I can do in one discussion. But now his foot's on the bridge. The next person he talks to, if they talk to him and ask him lots of questions and talk to him gently, he might put 2 feet on the bridge. That's the only way you're going to get him over the bridge. I actually don't want people to change their whole mindset in one conversation with me, because then I go, next person you talk to will be able to change you completely again. I want to leave them with questions that then sit with them and that they think about, and they do a bit of their own research. And next time I see them, they go, yeah, I had a thought about that. With that famous man, he's a generation older. He's more of a boomer. And I said to him, the thing is, when you were young, you were really radical. You were at the forefront of radical stuff. He was in entertainment, but he was like the establishment didn't like him and his crew. I said, if you were young now, I think you would be pro-trans, because that's the kind of radical, progressive, moving human rights forward. And that's how I think of you. And that got to him, I think. I think he went, oh, yeah, you see me as young and radical and hip. And of course, yeah, now it's very likely, he would be trans-inclusive. And I think that annoyed him a bit, but in a good way. Now, Natasha, there was one chapter that really stood out to me, big wellness. Can you talk to us about that? Because that's not something I cover in my book at all.
Well, the reason I called it big wellness is because people have very strong opinions about big pharma. And I understand why,
yes,
for reasons of nuance, particularly in the United States, where people access medication in a very different way to how we do here in the UK. But people will say, there is an incentive to keep people sick, keep people dependent. And they will point to the fact that the pharmaceutical industry is worth 1 billion pounds a year. However, the wellness industry is worth 4 times as much almost.
What?
Yeah.
Really?
And unlike the pharmaceutical industry, there are no checks and balances. There are no guardrails. And what it's done is, by sowing a mistrust in science, in doctors, in data, in academic institutions, it has undermined things which, people's faith in medicine, essentially.
That's
and
right,
is selling them alternatives which, in a lot of instances, don't do anything. In some instances, are causing harm. And I did put, in the interests of embracing complexity, women, for example, hardly any tests were done using women's bodies for a really, really long time. So there is more of a tendency to rely on networks of information, and this really worked for me. And it may not be robustly proven in the way that other medicines are. But there's a real throw the baby out with the bathwater thing. A friend of mine was having chemotherapy because she had breast cancer, and somebody contacted her on the internet and said, you must stop having chemotherapy immediately and eat 3 ripe peaches per day.
Are you kidding? My God.
And this is a very extreme example of what I'm talking about.
That's extraordinary. And so we need to look for nuance and rationality and evidence in all areas. It's not just politics. It could be how we're eating and what we're lifting. I'm completely sucked into Instagram now, and it might be right. I try and look at the sources, but as far as I can make out, if I don't lift weights every day, I'm going to just become custard. And if I don't eat all sorts of protein, this is, I'm really reducing my health span and my lifespan. And a lot of it is just some of it probably is just what is current and what's trending to create those videos. Any extreme of it's all about protein is probably wrong, because then people forget about fibre.
Exactly. And actually, most NHS doctors agree that the majority of the UK population is getting enough protein. There will always be exceptions, of course, but the majority of the UK population is deficient in fibre.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Because I went to I had some tests from a specialist, a lovely NHS specialist, and I said, I'm taking all these supplements, because I read that women need to take all the supplements. He said, I'm looking at your blood tests. You're slightly low in vitamin D, but so is everyone in the UK, because no sun.
There's no sun.
Yeah. And I said, that was before the heat wave, probably not now. But he said, take vitamin D every day. That's it. I'm looking at your tests. And I said, but what about this and what about that? And he went, you don't need it. He said, eat well, eat vegetables, move your body and meditate. That really encouraged me to think, don't be buying stuff you see on Instagram. Do deep research, because big wellness, when you say 4 times as much as the pharmaceutical industry, of course they're trying to sell you stuff.
And you need a health-life balance. I mean, these people will have you living like an elite athlete if they can.
Yes.
And ironically, that becomes then detrimental to your well-being, because, elite athletes, there's a limited span on how long they engage with that lifestyle. And also that's their whole job, So it eats up more and more and more of your time until you don't have time to do the things that bring you joy.
Yes, like that man that's trying to stay alive forever, but now he's got some terrible disease, because of course, if you just completely focus on that and you do lots of extreme things to your body, that's what's going to happen. So joy, breathing, going for a walk, all of those sorts of things might be better for you than obsessing about being in state 2 of cardio or all the other stuff, or taking all the supplements that are expensive.
The metrics that constantly, having a wearable and having all of these different metrics that you're monitoring constantly. I don't think that's good for your mental health. Interestingly, body image and wellness has become increasingly intertwined, and it's become a big part of the body image talk that I do in schools. And I always say to young people that the rules of health are so simple and you know them already. It's like, eat a varied diet, including lots of fruit and veg, stay hydrated, move when you can, get enough sleep, try not to overthink it. Done. But, there's all these multi-billion-pound industries that are dedicated to overcomplicating it.
Yes, and making it something that they can sell you. The ideas you've got at the end of how we can do stuff. In this podcast, we always like to talk about what can we do, what can we change. Can you talk us through some of those ideas that you've got at the end of the book?
Yeah, I really toyed with whether to put that chapter in, because in the book I'm wrangling with these kind of big structural societal ideas. And I didn't want the reader to come away with the impression that I was then going, and it's up to you as the individual to fix all of these things. However, I do think that there are simple things that we can all do that will make a difference, and that's how movements are grown. One of the things was to get your news from a variety of different sources. And I learned that when I was doing the Sky paper review for many, many years, that you just see the agenda so clearly when you look at a variety of different newspapers even. But also, like you were saying earlier, engaging with people. A really simple change I've made since I wrote the book is I've changed the sort of headphones I wear. So I don't have in-ear headphones anymore. I have the ones that go over your ear and they sort of crunch the sound into your head.
Why?
Because they go on the outside of your ear and then you can still hear what's happening around you.
I see.
Because I didn't appreciate how often someone's trying to strike up a conversation with me at the bus stop, or people are saying hello to me in my street. And I was just not noticing. So I think things like that, looking up, making eye contact, connecting, community is going to be super, super important.
The people that have made and designed these phones have an agenda, and that agenda is power and money.
Yes.
So they haven't designed an addictive little box that you can hold in your hand that is coincidentally, as I read the other day, the same size as a packet of cigarettes, so that you can be healthier in your community, less reliant on money, have a healthier perception of what success and connection looks like. They've not designed that. They've designed something that will keep you coming back to them.
And also, that I actually made a note of it because it was one of those lines that really made me go, whoa, in your book, when you say that an algorithm is like a psychopath because it's learned how to do an impression of something that cares about you.
Yes, yeah.
AI
is a psychopath. It doesn't even feel for itself. It doesn't feel for anybody. It doesn't even feel for itself. It doesn't feel, but it can convince you. So all of these, now people are doing AI therapy and having AI girlfriends, and you are literally hiring a psychopath. You're paying for a psychopath. Or people say, well, I like to talk my ideas through with Claude. And I'm like, right. But Claude will say, well done. That's a great idea. I agree with you. That is literally like inviting a psychopathic narcissist into your home and saying, what do you think of this idea for my screenplay? Or, hey, I've been feeling really low lately and really lonely. If you knew that person was a well-known psychopath who could feel nothing and had told you, I can feel nothing. I'm just faking it. I'm pretending. I'm reflecting back to you. I'm manipulating your feelings. I'm telling you flattering things. Would you go, well, it's better than being alone?
No. It's so true. And also that it's trying to make you dependent on it, which is exactly what a narcissist would do as well.
One thing that I wanted to ask you about was that an incredible video that you made a little while ago where you said you can always tell how well the economy's doing by how much you're perceived to be, as a mixed race person, to be more black or more white. And this really plays into an episode we did recently with Harry Tanner, who talks about the history of homophobia. He's an academic who's researched the history of homophobia, and he says you can trace it back to the Greeks, ancient civilizations. When there is a boom, people are less homophobic. When there's a bust and people are feeling the pinch, they're more homophobic.
Yeah.
Is this something you see as well with racism? Is that the point that you're making?
You can tell when people are asking a question with a desire to learn more and when they're asking it with a desire to other and exclude you from the group. And I think when there is a perceived scarcity of resources, you start to hear the questions being asked in a hostile way. So like, where are you from, for example? I have no issue with that question if it's asked in a kind of, a curious way.
So I'm from Australia. What's your background?
Yes,
as opposed
exactly.
to where are you from? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And you can see now the conversations that are being had. I mean, there was a right-wing politician, I forget from which party, but was recently saying that in order to qualify as British, all 4 of your grandparents had to be born in Britain, which I think we did last hear that from the Nazis. It's not hyperbolic to kind of conflate those
Who's
two
saying
things.
That?
It was a politician on the right. I can't remember
like
exactly.
Like a Restore politician.
Yeah, on the very extreme fringes of the right.
But as we know, the Overton window.
Exactly.
Saying all 4 of your grandparents have to be British or you're not British.
Yeah, that's what qualifies you apparently as a British person. So I think what I feel is a thirst to other and exclude more now than I did 10 years ago.
It's so interesting that you said that because it really reminded me of what Harry said. And Harry's perception of the economy's links to homophobia are, I think, explored in Tiptoe, the Russell T Davies drama, where we see the man who is homophobic, suspicious of his neighbour. He's portrayed in a kind of complex and nuanced way where he could be a good guy and he could be kind and he could be a good dad to his son who is gay and closeted, and he has all these invitations in. And at one point he actually physically defends a drag queen who's assaulted and cradles her in his arms. So you can see this humanity coming through. But one of the things that plays out is he feels emasculated about his job, that people, instead of calling him in as a qualified electrician, are doing stuff through YouTube and doing it themselves. And then he blames an immigrant worker for, you've taken my job, in his mind. And so you see exactly what you're talking about when people feel, when unregulated capitalism takes people's livings away or threatens their livings, you can see that moral compass inside teetering. And it's a conversation I've had with taxi drivers before who've voted for Brexit. I say, why? And they say, well, Uber came in, all these Uber drivers. And I said, but who brought in unregulated Uber?
Yeah.
It was the Conservatives. It was actually Boris Johnson, I think, was the mayor when it happened, and he could have stopped that. And he could have regulated it. He could have said, okay, well, we have minicabs. You can have X number of cars. You can't have any more. You can't surge price. You can't do this. You can't do that. He could have regulated it. One of the taxi drivers told me there was some cronyism in who knew who owned Uber and so on and so on. I don't know the exact details, but that there was some cronyism where some Conservative politicians had a vested financial interest in allowing Uber to come in completely unregulated. You're blaming immigrants who are desperately trying to make a living and not usually making a good living on anything that's app-based, because the big companies are creaming off all the money and using immigrant labour to do self-employed, hour-by-hour gig economy work. But you're blaming the immigrants who are desperate for that money, and you're not blaming the big guys who have done that, who are getting the big kickbacks. And I've had that conversation with a number of taxi drivers who've said kind of fair play. Where are they getting to you to look? The ones with power are the ones who can define the enemy.
Yeah.
By definition, they've got power and they've got influence. So if the enemy has been defined for you, always question who the enemy is, because it's usually the ones with power who've done that. And it was just so interesting to hear you say that as a mixed race person, you feel a more racist environment where people feel a scarcity of resources because of scapegoating.
Yes. And there's something you say in your book. What is the word? Jackal something?
Jackal baiting.
Jackal baiting. Yeah. I think if you are either an immigrant or not white or LGBTQ+, there's a sense that your inclusion is conditional. I also think that people sometimes conflate visibility with power. So they think, because again, I talk about it in the book, Black people are slightly overrepresented in advertising. If the aim of advertising is to faithfully represent the population, which I don't think it is or should be, but if you're seeing Black people on your television all the time, it can lead to a kind of subconscious thought process where you think, well, they're doing all right, but I'm struggling.
Right. Yes, because they're in this ad for flat screen televisions and kitchenware. My response to that, when people complain about mixed race families in advertising, Sainsbury's and King Argos do not give a fuck about representation. They're trying to make money. The reason they use mixed race families in advertising is so clear to me, so more people can see themselves represented on the screen. Because if there's a Black person and a white person and a brown person, we can all imagine ourselves going to Argos and buying a canoe. That's why. It's just as simple as that. They sell more stuff when more people can see themselves in the picture.
Yeah.
End of story. If it didn't sell more stuff, if only featuring white people sold more stuff, do you know who they'd feature? Only white people. If only featuring Black people sold more canoes, that's what they do. They are just showing you lots of different people so you can all imagine yourself. And it must work because capitalists don't care. The BBC cares about, we should make David Copperfield more egalitarian. Of course, the BBC are meant to care. Iceland doesn't care.
Yeah, very true.
It doesn't care. The bed shop that's selling 2-for-1 on bunk beds and queen-size mattresses, does it give a fuck about fairness or equality or representation? No, it doesn't. It just sells more queen-size mattresses. That's all. And therefore, they must be representing the population quite well. Natasha, I'd like to read a little bit from the ending of your book. Is that okay?
Please do.
Dedicating ourselves to recognizing and valuing nuance while revealing the terrifying complexity of the world actually makes changing your patch a much easier task. It will become clearer when you are being lied to and manipulated. It will allow you to look beyond the simplistic solutions in inverted commas given by those who don't actually want anything to change or whose grift benefits only themselves. Most of all, nuance improves the quality of conversation with the people around you. When we converse meaningfully, we connect, and that connection has the power to heal divides. Nuance doesn't just make us more accurate in our judgments, it makes us more compassionate towards others. Despite what the enemies of nuance might insist, those two things are not at odds with one another. We have lived through a nuance drought where fear and conflict have grabbed our attention and polarization has followed. The consequences are everywhere. The time has come to bridge those gaps, to rebuild our communities, to start drinking from the well of nuance and to quench our thirst. I thought that was really, really lovely. And that's really stayed with me. And I keep thinking that the well of nuance, we need to quench our thirst. Many people don't know that they're dehydrated for nuance. Some young people have been raised in this environment where that's all they know is 5 definite things and 1 stupid thing and, whatever it is. I think that's really beautifully put. And I might print it out to put on my desk.
Thank you.
It's really, really nice. I really encourage all of our listeners to read The Nuance Drought, to quench your thirst with Natasha Devon's brilliant book. I think it makes a great companion piece to my book, 6 Conversations We're Scared to Have. These 2 books would be great to read for your book club and you could compare and contrast them, not to give you too much work to do. But if you don't have a book club, why not start one and start with these? Because I think more than anything, we need to be having these more nuanced and detailed and compassionate and thoughtful conversations with space and air around them. I've really enjoyed your book and thank you very much, Natasha, for joining us today. Is there anything you came to say that you didn't get to say?
No, I think we have truly covered everything.
Great. There's lots more in the book, but that's what a book is. It's a long conversation over a period of time, and a book, by definition, allows you to think things through. You pick up a chapter, you put it down. You can go back and read something again. So the very act of reading a book like this, I think, gives you that space and air to think about it. You have been listening to The Guilty Feminist with me, Deborah Frances-White, and my very special guest, Natasha Devon. The Guilty Feminist theme tune was composed by Mark Hodge. The producer for The Spontaneity Shop was Tom Zielinski. Thanks to Ned Sedgwick, Gina DCO and Zainab Mohammed, as well as all of you for listening. For more information about this and other episodes, visit guiltyfeminist.com.